Hi everyone, I'm Steve Napier and I'm based in Sydney and I work for Obodo. To everyone, to the people that keep coming back, thank you so much. Guess we're still putting out quality content 3 years later. And then we have my colleague Joe Ballister, who's based in Melbourne. He's the Obodo country manager. And then also,
Hello, Steve.
sorry, I should allow you to say hello.
Hello, Steve. Hello, everyone. Thank you.
We also have Cliff Tonga, who's based in Melbourne, and Cliff works for Britain Timbers. So Britain Timbers are the importer for Obodo's Vulcan timber into Australia in Sydney, Brisbane, and Melbourne. And I could not have written this presentation without Cliff. His knowledge on coatings is second to none. So thank you, Cliff. And he's joined in as moral support and to answer any super complicated questions. So thank you, Cliff.
Yeah, hey Stephen, it's good to be back. It's been a couple of years, and very interesting to see the feedback from the audience.
Quickly, if anyone has struggled in some way to get hold of the CPD question sheet, it is in the handouts. So you can grab the CPD question sheet. It's in Microsoft Word format. And you don't need to send that to me because I will automatically send you your CPD certificate in the next 48 hours. Something we are going to start, but something which Joe and I were just discussing was, why are you guys attending this presentation? It's quite a specific topic. We know you're very passionate about timber, but why were you?
Well, I'm sure there's people that just attend every Obodo webinar because we are so interesting. However, yes, it's a good question. Very specialised topic, but it's a key element. Coatings, how coatings work with timber, it's very important. So just pop in if you're so inclined. Just pop into the chat why you're particularly interested, if so. But also your questions as we go along. I'm sure Steve will explain. Just pop your questions as you go along, and then we'll attend to them at the end of the session.
So if you have, as we go, and this is, to be honest, this is quite a deeply technical presentation, and I'm going to move a little quickly, and because it's more technical, and I haven't presented this sort of 10 or 20 times, I am going to have to refer to my notes. So I will be reading some notes, but as questions come to you, please just pop them in the chat box, and Joe is going to mark them as a question, and we'll get those at the end. Also, if you disagree with something I say, please pop it in the chat box and we'll definitely address it because everyone's experiences are a little different. So yeah, please. This isn't one-sided. Oh, these some good ones coming in. Clients' expectations.
Wow, there's some good ones coming through already.
Please mark all those, Joe.
Yeah, very good ones. Wow. I just opened the box and it's all coming out. But hey, keep them coming. We're gonna have plenty of time at the end to discuss this.
Yeah. Awesome. Cool. Well, I'm going to get going. So I hope I say this correctly. Bujari Gamarua. I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of this land, and pay my respects to the elders, both past and present. It's rather wonderful. The city of Sydney, where I live, on Gadigal country, they've started a campaign where they've been introducing some of the local Gadigal language. So I think it's rather wonderful. So a little bit about the presentation as an overview, just to provide an overview of the fundamental aspects of wood and its inherent structure, as well as the safeguarding of timber through the application of coatings. And within this discussion, we're going to delve into the effectiveness of these coatings and what can be anticipated. So it's 4 key topics: timber species and genetics, surface textures, so important, coatings, obviously, and then moving forward. So timber species and genetics. So we need to start the journey in the forest. So, using its broad root system, the tree of any species pulls moisture and nutrients up through its trunk to feed its growth. And this is really achieved via its cell structure, which, if we think of a tree's cell structure, we need to think of a big bundle of straws. And that big bundle of straws represents the cell structure, and that cell structure is running up through the trunk of the tree. So, as many would know, when boards are cut from the tree, it's done down the length of the tree trunk. And here is what we see is what it may actually look like. So this drawing shows us that cell structure and how it runs down the length of the board. And as explained in the previous slide, the cells look like a bundle of straws. So here we're actually opening up the tree trunk. So, slicing the tree across rather than down, we look at some of the important parts of the trunk. Now, not to overwhelm you with all of this, because this is not all relevant, we'll just focus on 3 key characteristics that relate to the coating side of things. So we have the bark, which actually acts to protect the tree during its life. Think of this a bit like a human skin. The seasonal growth rings, which as many would know, represent the seasonal changes. And the lighter colored rings are the early wood, which is during the spring and the warmer months, and these are always much bigger. And the late wood, which is the darker rings, is during the autumn and colder months. So we're going to look at hardwood cell structures. So at this point, I'm guessing maybe you're like, oh, why, you're telling us all about tree growth rings, and wish I just get to the point. However, this information is important because as they affect the aesthetics of the timber and how you use. So first up, here's hardwood, and to be specific, Australian hardwood. Now with the hardwood, you don't get a very distinctive growth ring. And this is because the majority of the hardwood we use doesn't grow in very clear winter and summer climates. Our tree growth rings are actually informed by wet and dry seasons, and I really want you to take note of how dense the cell structure is in the slide. And it's very important because the more dense your cell structure, the more difficult it is for the coating to actually penetrate. So now we're going to look at softwoods. And in the softwoods, you can very clearly see these growth rings. And the dark rings is your dense late wood, which is colder months. They're smaller. And the lighter color is your early wood, which is the growth during the warmer months. Now, if we look at the cell structure of the softwood, you can see how open it is. This means it's actually easier for the coating to travel into the timber. And you also may be saying, but Steve, we only have hardwoods here in Australia. Why are you talking about softwoods, especially in feature timber? But this is actually changing and really fast. I've been working with timber for about 15 years, and I've seen a big decline in the quality and the quantity of hardwoods. We've got the government's really shutting all these forests down. But we still have a great demand for timber. And so over the next few short years, we're actually going to see a massive growth and the import of softwoods into Australia. So we need to jump onto this now to really understand all this. So here we're looking at a single cell from the timber and understanding what the drying process is. So the green cell is showing us a typical cell when the tree is cut down, regardless of species. And the walls and the cells hold up to about 25% moisture content, roughly. Now, the kiln drying takes the moisture content down to between 12 and 14%. And this is done to aid the timber stabilization and minimize cracking and movement. The cell on the right is a step further. which is thermal modification. Now, in the previous slide, I said we're going to see an increase in softwood supply here in Australia. Now, traditionally, softwoods is treated with harsh chemicals to make it more durable. So think your treated pine framing and so forth. However, the new treatment for softwoods is thermal modification. That's one of the types of treatment being used. There are other types. There are other ways to increase the durability and stability of softwoods, but the heat treatment or thermal modification is the main one used globally. So thermal modification is a chemical-free treatment whereby an intense heat removes the tannins and water from the cell walls and then closes the cell walls. So you end up with a timber which is more durable, doesn't leach tannins, and is much, much more stable. So let's look at movement, because movement is a key part of making your coating last longer and lowering maintenance. So these are some really, really key points. So tangential movement actually refers to the movement across your board. Now, this is really important because you know, when you're especially in tongue and groove cladding, there's a very minimal allowance for shrinkage and expansion. So what we really want at the end of the day is as close to low or zero movement as possible, not just because of weather tightness, but also simply because of your content, your maintenance. So if we look at something, you know, I know a lot of blackbutt gets used, very, very high movement. Silver top ash probably shouldn't be used outside, but also very high movement. And I've shown our Vulcan. So our Vulcan is the thermally modified, but there's an additional process to that. So very low movement, thermally modified pine, medium, cedar, low. Now, also important to have a look at geography and climate. So in the previous slide, I introduced timber movement and how it increases maintenance. So we need to understand that timber moves when water moves in and out of the cell wall. And you may or may not remember that when the timber is thermally modified, or as some refer to it, heat treated, the cell walls are collapsed and sealed so water can't move in and out of that cell wall. So when your water moves in and out of the cell wall during various climates, in various climates, your timber is going to move, which disrupts the coating. And I'm going to get onto this a little bit further on.
Steve, if I can just add, all good points. But this relationship between the wood and its properties and its movement, and as we head towards the performance of the coatings with that wood, is important. Obviously, it can be a little confusing. So we are here into the future. If you've got a particular project, you need to reinforce some of these principles. There's a lot of material out there on various websites, but we're here to assist further understanding of those relationships.
Awesome stuff. So the bark is a skin. So besides being beautiful, the bark on a tree acts like a skin protecting the trunk. Obviously, we can't have bark on every piece of cladding or every batten, which is why we use a coating. So the coating acts to stabilize the timber to minimize the surface cracking. And we're going to go a little bit more on this later. So we also need to now look at the way we cut timber. So this is all on the subject of moving. And high moving timbers increase your timber maintenance. So this is why we need to look at the cutting of logs. So flat sawn is the most commonly used method here in Australia and around the world. This is due to the efficiency of cutting and how much timber you get from the log. It's just the most sustainable and the most cost effective. However, the big downside is that the timber boards will move a lot. So when a timber isn't naturally stable, I should say, this isn't such an issue, but for something like high moving Australian hardwoods, this is a bit of an issue.
You can tell the flat sawn. You can see the cross section there. We can actually see the radial grooves. So the two, when you look at the log, the far left and the far right are examples of that piece down the bottom there, where the shrinkage along the grain is more excessive.
Awesome. Thanks, Joe. So quarter sawn, it's not commonly used because it is a higher cost, but it is one of the most stable cuts, and it is actually best for your coating. So you can see between the two of these, you get a very different grain pattern. And you can actually see, you've got large areas of the darker, which is the late wood, which does affect the coatings as well. So we're just going to have a very quick look at our Vulcan timbers. So our Vulcan timber, it's a plantation, it's an FSC plantation radiata pine from the North Island of New Zealand, which we heat treat, so the thermal modification. And using this cost-effective but higher moving flat sawn timber boards, we actually glue them together, which creates a structural grade piece of lumber. And we then slice these blocks perpendicular to the glue line, creating an incredibly stable board. So as you can see very faintly, I try to put them in, I should probably use white, but you can see how we actually slice them down rather than across.
So we're trying to recreate that quarter sawn
Exactly.
piece of timber to minimize movement.
So yeah, very much mimicking that whole quarter sawn kind of effect. And so here's what that sliced board would look like, whether you use it in its form like this or whether you turn it into something like timber cladding or timber batten. So if you look very closely, you can see very faintly, but almost not, some glue lines. So we now have a very stable thermally modified board, which can be used in many, many different applications. And I know, like for me, I've done many projects here in Sydney where we've used a 180 cladding board, not face fixed, and coated it black. And after a couple of years, it still looks really, really good. So a quick refresher, note the tighter cells in the late wood and the openness of the early wood cells. So you can actually see very distinctly, and you can see, well, what is the coating going to go into more easily and what is going to be more effective. You're obviously wanting a much more open cell. So here we're actually seeing it. So just showing you the density effects of the coating. So the darker furry bands are the early wood and the smooth bands are the late wood. So you can actually see, and I'm actually going to show you some like real weather testing in a few minutes. Now, in this image, we're actually seeing a spotted gum weathered 12 months with a Q-tech and a pigmentation in it. You can, to a very small degree, see how the early and late wood bands weather differently if you do look quite closely. As mentioned previously, we're going to see a sharp increase in heat-treated timber as well in the near future. So let's have a little look at surface texture. So there's some really good questions in it. I'm trying to not get distracted, but they're absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, I'm reading them.
I'm a little bit jealous. Let's make a switch into one of the most vital parts of why your coating doesn't last, and that's the surface texture. So the surface texture of most timber here in Australia is dressed, so it's got that smooth surface. And the issue with that is that it's actually closing off the cells and not allowing the coating to properly permeate. And also the pigmentation, which doesn't go deep into the timber, the pigmentation sits on the surface. It's not allowing it to hold on to anything. It's not quite a slippery slide, but that's the best analogy I can just suck right now. In an ideal world, we'd not be putting any coating on external hardwood for around 12 months. So typically on a hardwood, in an ideal situation, what we'd actually be doing on a smooth timber is we'd actually be leaving it to weather with no coating for about 12 months, allow the surface to kind of open up, and then the coating can actually go in. Now, this is not a hardwood, this is cedar, but this very much kind of replicates what would happen at a microscopic level. So you can actually see new on the left versus some weathers. You can see how it's actually opened up. Now,
what you're saying is just about one of the hardest things to coat is smooth dressed hardwood. It's quite impenetrable.
Very much so.
What you're saying.
Very much so. So what is the ideal surface? And the ideal surface texture for external timber is actually fine sawn. Because really what it's doing is it's opening up the cells, sort of breaking that surface. And then that sort of slight texture is allowing the pigmentation to actually grab onto something.
And Stephen, to add a point, even if it came to bow restrictions, you would still apply the same principle. If you had to use a bow species, any surface texture in exposure work or testing we've done, you can see that there's a far better coating uptake and a far better performance. And so if there's one thing you take out of this is that exterior-wise, in terms of cladding, a fine bandsawn is the best surface to apply a penetrating stain to.
Awesome. Thank you, Cliff. Is this true to hardwoods too? Yes, it is. So this is really interesting. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, so it says, basically, as Cliff just said, basically with the BAL requirement for a bushfire attack level requirement, you pretty well need to consider using a hardwood, and the way to get better coating performance is to give it that sawn surface treatment.
Now this is actual weathering, and on the left we have dressed timber with 1 and 2 coats, and on the right we have fine sawn timber with 1 and 2 coats. And you can really see the importance of how many coats you put on. I handle the New South Wales market. I personally always suggest to my clients that actually apply 3 coats. It's not a must. So for most of my projects, what I suggest for our Vulcan, and we have our own protector oil system, which I will elaborate on a little bit later. For most of them, I tell them to put 2 coats on in the factory and then apply a 3rd coat around 6 months later. So typically done towards the end of a project. And what you're really doing is you're allowing the first 2 coats to settle in and cure. And then that sort of 3rd and final coat is that, I guess, cherry on the cake or cherry on the timber. And you're actually building up those layers. And I've seen it personally in some of the projects, which, I mean, I've been with Abodo coming up 5 years now, seeing some of these projects where they've done 2 and 3 coats. You know, a couple of projects I've got in mind are just around the corner from each other. One did 2 coats in black, one did 3 coats. Crazy difference. Both still looking beautiful in their own way.
So it's about building up the pigment, right? Inside the timber.
Now, a hardwood is very dense, and putting a fine sawn texture on a hardwood can be quite a challenge, just because of its density. So, I mean, what I do suggest, and this is not a hardwood, this is our Vulcan timber in a project literally finished 2 months ago in Double Bay, where the client didn't want a fine sawn texture, they wanted a smooth texture. So my suggestion was at least sand the boards back using like an 80 grit sandpaper. So you're kind of trying to break that surface and sort of open it up. It's better than nothing.
Yeah.
It's the next best. It's the next best thing.
It's the minimum you could do.
Yeah. To me, this would be an absolute minimum. So it's going to be very interesting to see This actually faces north and west. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this looks in 12 months' time. So hopefully
Well, the
go on.
interesting thing in its favour, Stephen, is because it's stable. That's what's probably going to assist its performance. And
Yes.
there's one thing you take from a lot of this. If you can boil it down to why coatings, how coatings perform, it comes down to its stability, to either moisture movement or thermal movement. That's it in its simplicity.
Awesome. The other one is brushed. Now, almost impossible to do with an Australian hardwood. This is something which we've started doing, and we've actually seen this a lot with internal engineered flooring. A lot of it comes brushed, or sometimes they'll call it scraped. And at Aboda, we actually have a range, an option for this external timber, and it's really just inspired by driftwood. So what you can see is the sort of dents in the timber is actually the early wood, so the softer timber which has been scraped out, and then the sort of outer bumps are the late wood. And what this is doing is it's a bit like sanding, I guess. It's really roughening that
Yeah.
that surface texture.
This is one of my favorite textures, Stephen. You've known this for a long time, and in testing we've done, what's quite interesting, regardless of coating, what we've realized, and depending on the coating type, but typically in anything that requires penetration, what we have realized is that fine sawn performs the best, then brushed, then sanding, then dressed or nothing. So yeah, so it is a good finish option.
Awesome. Thank you, Clevy.
Pretty sexy looking as
It's
well.
gorgeous. I've actually just got a project the Northern Beaches here where they coated it in black. It's just coming to the end of construction, and it's just amazing. So before we properly jump into coatings, and I am going to focus primarily on oils, there are two parts. So the oil, which goes into the timber, and the pigmentation, which sits on the surface. Now, in this slide, we're going to look at the oil. So in short, polymers are a collection of units. So being the oil, which seeps into the timber surface, and it actually forms a bond. And excuse me, this bond is really the water repellent layer. So when a timber is high moving, these polymers can actually break and cause weakness, which in turn leads to more water going into the timber. So in a high density timber, especially when the timber is dressed, it's extremely difficult for these oils / polymers to go into the timber and form a bond. And this is why we advocate for roughening the timber surface. So the bottom diagram shows how the cells are really broken open by the roughening of the surface, allowing the coating to go a little bit further.
And to your point, Stephen, this illustrates at a technical level for everyone why it's important from a spec perspective to either have sanding, brushed, or fine sawn. Because if you, whatever coating you choose, if it, and depending on the function and application, it will not perform as well if you do not then choose the right surface texture for it to go with, and also look at also the timbers, the choice of the timber that you use in that application. So there's three parts to it, not just one part. So
I have to confess I'm slightly freaking out that I'm getting some of this a little bit incorrect, because you are the expert. So if I am a little bit incorrect, please correct me.
you've done well. You've done really well.
Although I do know all this. So really the second part to the coating is the pigmentation, which we all perhaps see as something to change or enhance the timber's color. But it's actually its most important role is to act as a UV block. So the pigmentation really forms a bond on the surface, once again, a bit like chains. And And this layer of pigmentation can easily be broken by high moving timber, which results in a rapid breakdown and obviously higher maintenance as well.
So, Steve, I get a very regular question from architects and builders is, can I use a clear oil? Does it need to have pigment or colour in it? And my general response, I think, is to say, well, look, you need pigment in the oil to provide resistance against UV, because a clear oil will not provide resistance to weathering and will grey off a lot quicker. Is that correct?
100%.
Absolutely, Steve. Joe, and I'll give you this analogy because I thought about this before going on board, and this probably goes back to the freeway conversation we had 10 years ago, when we're talking. At some point, you use an analogy here, using moisturizer and sunscreen, which obviously is used a lot. A moisturizer at its core is about keeping the skin moist and keeping excess water from drying it out. But it doesn't matter how much moisture you put on there, if you don't put sunscreen on top of it, the skin's going to burn. And then so at some point, there's a function to go with fashion as well. So you can put as much moisturizer on your skin as you want, but if you don't put the sunscreen on top, and there's a high amount of UV, you're gonna get burnt, and that's no different from timber. It is the holy grail, Joe. It's something I test and look for all the time. That if we find a clear oil that can keep the timber natural, we'll be billionaires if we find it.
To those of you who have to run, someone just messages they have to run. Everyone is going to get a recording of this presentation. So if you need to run or whatever happens, you will get a recording. Everyone's going to get a recording of this presentation.
Do not rush out the door, everybody.
We will answer the questions. I know there's some really good ones here.
Steve's going to tell you that. Steve's going to tell you that at the end, but Ryan's got to go.
So let's look at the coating type. So in this instance, and it's something that comes up a lot, we're getting into this, doing nothing, simply not putting any coating on timber, allowing nature to do its thing. But I ask you this, and Joe and I discussed this. If you were to purchase a car and had the option of having a quality paint to protect the surface or have it without paint, which would you go for? Yes, the unpainted car will last quite a while, but you will get a lot more mileage and it'll look a hell of a lot better for longer. It's exactly the same with timber. So, even if you do go with a highly durable hardwood, the timber simply will not last or look good for as long as you want it to or as you may think. If you've got nothing protecting the timber, no bark or no coating. So, yes, your timber will break down a lot quicker. I hope I put that well, Cliff.
No, I think it's pretty self-explanatory, the way you put it. Yeah, the question I also put is how does it age? Does it age gracefully as well? So.
And yes, I have definitely seen situations where they've used a cladding or a screening and gone back 5 years later and, it's a hardwood like a spotted gum and it looks really good. But just because you do it in Palm Beach, in Sydney, it doesn't mean it's going to work in the Alpine regions. It doesn't mean it's going to work anywhere else. It's like, in some ways, it's a bit of a fluke.
Yeah.
The way I think about it is that the new age timbers, the timbers you're talking about, Steve, the lower density softwoods, timbers like our timber and other sort of thermally treated timbers, probably could do a lot better to be coated. They'll definitely enjoy the protection of the coating. With the hardwoods, I guess they're blessed with having high density and long-term durability. But as Cliff just said, coating timber is not just about protecting the timber, but it's also about managing the aesthetic. Some parts of the building will weather and other parts not. So you can use the coating, I think, to manage the aesthetic of the whole
Yeah,
window.
you can't underestimate that, the aesthetic side of things. So
So let's talk about film coatings. Obviously, this is a film coating, and from what I could see close up, it is Western red cedar. Yes, you can use a film coating, but this is how you expect it to weather. Um,
and like I said, there's other. Yeah, the film coatings do get a bad rap in the industry, but I see a lot of it because it's the wrong application, or the expectation around the application
yes,
hasn't really been communicated from that perspective. And I think we've done this in other seminars, guys, where they're very good for doors and windows, they're very good for decking, but that's very different from a cladding area or garage where it might not be always suitable.
So what do you call a film
Yeah,
coat, Cliff? So with the pigmented oils, we're talking products like our protector oil. You got products like Q-Tech and Waka, and these are penetrating
yep.
pigmented oils. What are we
So
calling a film
typically
coat?
they're using brand names out there. You got things like Sickens, which is a common coating in the space. You got the Intergrain range. You got Hames, Johnson. And I don't blame the architects. It's confusing. There's so many brand names, and you just got to break it down. And this is for the architects, and we'll get into this at the back end. You just got to look at the type of coating it is, and what the function and what it does from that perspective. But hopefully that answers your question, Joe. Basically, they're coatings that sit more on top, and they're pigment and a bit of resin that sit more on top of the surface. And you can usually tell aesthetically straight away what they look like. And I think architects know they look a bit more probably not as natural looking as probably the feedback that people architects give about those type of coatings. So.
yeah, it is. So with film coatings, it's a lot like once it starts to weather,
Yeah.
it will rapidly go downhill, and then the cost to recoat it's labor intensive and it's quite high. And when it's with film coatings, like you've got to dot all your I's and cross all your T's. You really do have to. It's a lot more fiddly, but it absolutely does have its application. But this is actually my favorite example of a film forming, and this is at my local pool, where they used a film forming coating on some hardwood seating, and this is what it looked like after 12 months. In fact, I was sitting there and I was like, oh my god, I can't believe I'm sitting on hardwood, and I was like, I have to take a photo of this. And so we have kind of touched on it and people have asked some questions. The film forming coating sits on the surface more. And once again, it just kind of forms those chains like a bond. So with a combination of afternoon sun beating on it, the movement of the hardwood and moisture, and because it's on a horizontal surface, it's really broken this down. And I mean, in its own way, in some ways, it is beautiful. Really, though, the most widely used coating in Australia are mineral oils. Mineral oils are a highly refined petrochemical. So, yes, that is petrol. Perhaps the most widely known and used brand in Australia would be Q-Tech. And the way mineral oil works is it works its way into the surface of the timber and aims to create a water repellent barrier to stabilize the timber. The difficulty is that once you've used a mineral oil with a petrochemical, it's actually very difficult to use another coating type should you wish to switch over because you feel that it didn't work, simply because the mineral oil never actually dries. So, I mean, I know I get a lot of questions, and I know, Cliffy, you do as well, where people contact you and say, I've used a mineral oil and, it's faded too quickly. And, what do I put over the top? It's a process.
Oh, it definitely is a process. Stephen, and not a very cost-effective process. And the comment I get with a lot of, and Joe's brought me out the side as an independent consultant to look at different situations in the past, or even Stephen. And I say to clients, I wish you had known about another option at the beginning to avoid this the cost involved in terms of rectification. So again, like mineral oils, they have their place in the market. I believe that they are better applied in certain situations, just like the film coatings. The issue that sometimes is when they probably extend past what their best performance is. But yeah, I typically seen it used very well in decking and very well used in furniture, and from a cladding perspective, it depends on the area, specification, and client expectation. Is my feedback on that.
Not to make anyone worried. Now, with mineral oils, so mineral oils actually only hold a very small amount of pigment, which is one of the reasons we don't see them actually lasting very long. So they're actually, mineral oils aren't really designed to hold pigmentation. The other reason we don't see mineral oils lasting very long is because typically manufacturers, the timber cladding manufacturers and so forth, will actually suggest putting a clear coat of the mineral oil on in the factory. And in the majority of cases, it is QDEC. So when the timber gets to site and installed, the builders or the painters put another coat on, which is then pigmented because you're wanting to keep the color of the timber. Now, this first coat of clear oil is unfortunately reducing the effectiveness of this pigmentation. And in this image, you can actually see how it's faded after 12 months facing west. And you can kind of see the mold starting to kind of seep in.
Stephen, you make a very, very good point. Me working for a manufacturer, and I can say this openly, when you're applying a mineral oil, and there's others in the market, and not just QTech, there's Quantum, there's Integrated Universal Oil. From a manufacturing perspective, there's no drying involved. We basically run it through the line, and they're just stacked on top of each other and wrapped from that perspective. From an economics in terms of use of labor, it's very, very low. But the reality is, if you're trying to get color for performance and you're using application, you're better to use a coating that has better pigment penetration from the get-go and drying. So if the intention is to use it on cladding and it's a worn out or black as such, you're better to imbue that color from the first process rather than do it from the secondary, third process, because as you see from the previous slides, you want it to go through, the pigment to carry through as far as you can, rather than being something you just put on the top of an existing situation. So,
yeah, awesome. And this is actually the same wall facing west, and yeah, you can see how really the mold has kind of started to set in, and you've got that uneven weathering. This is, as Cliff has touched on, this is not to say mineral oils don't have their place, because they absolutely do. Everything's kind of designed for a reason. They each have their own speciality. From our experience, a great application for a clear mineral oil would be to use it perhaps as a clear coating on something like shingles, wash it down and recoat it every few years. This is where you'd like the timber to weather. The other thing,
Just a time check. Sorry, Steve, just a time check. You got I have to pick up the pace on the slide to allow questions at the end.
So highly exposed decks are also a great application for a clear mineral oil, but it's important to realize that you're actually relying on the sun to change the color to a gray. As you can see here at the Docklands Library in Melbourne, the cladding is quite patchy because it's not actually getting direct sun. So you very much are relying on direct sun. So this brings us to the next point of, well, how do we actually achieve even weathering? And so there's actually something quite new on the market, new in terms of being around for about 8 years here in Australia. And what it is it's a process where there's no recoat required for up to 7 years. Should be noted, you may need to do a bit of a wash down, although I've got projects here in Sydney, which is like 3 and 4 years, and they're still looking really good. It's very even weathering, so no matter the elevation. And you can see here, the whole thing is weathered evenly. And this product is called CU. And what I'm actually going to do, rather than explaining CU, I've actually got a little video, so you don't have to listen to me.
COX patented silicon technology protects wood through a process using two products: a wood protection followed by a surface protection. First, apply a layer of COX wood protection. This permeates deep into the wood, unlike older silicate techniques that remain on the surface and are prone to cracking and falling off. Then, apply the surface protection. This reinforces the wood protection while still allowing the right amount of moisture to sink in, creating optimal conditions for the hardening process. The hardening and mineralization processes begin. The silicon molecules in and around the wood fibers expand, going deep into the wood. Together, they create a network. The network fuses the silicon to the wood, strengthening it and offering a unique silicon shield that protects and gives the surface a natural grey tint. The silicon shield is an excellent all-round protector from nature's forces. COX wood and surface protection mimics nature's own shield and lasts up to 15 years. And the wood just becomes more beautiful over time.
So CU is not something which, it's not a mineral oil, it's not film forming, it's what we can class as a reactive treatment, and it is quite revolutionary in its technology. Now, for those of you who may have missed bits in that video, it is on our YouTube channel, on the Abodo YouTube channel. I have also just shared the manual/brochure in the handouts of that, so you can actually get a little bit more information. So as a part of the weathering process, this is what you would expect the CU to look like at about sort of maybe 4 to 6 months. And then what you're going to see up to between 6 months and 18 months, it becomes kind of quite a whitish gray. And I'm skipping through this because you've watched the video. And then what you're seeing here is what they reference in the video, which is the part 2. So this is how your building is going to look from about year 2 up until probably about year 5, and that is dependent on the location. It is going to weather to a much deeper gray much quicker if you're close to the ocean and to large bodies of water, and so forth. Was there anything you wanted to add on that one, Cliff?
I think the beauty of the CU is the fact that it doesn't limit your design intent. So it kind of takes the whole other aspects that we discussed earlier and kind of simplifies it, knowing that it's kind of weather regardless of orientation, and you can even get those areas to even catch up to other areas. It's the one system I've seen where you have some consistency of what it does, and yeah, it's just more and more people want coatings where there's less recoat maintenance going forward, and that's what this speaks to going forward. It still requires some washing like any system does, and there'll be powder coating, paint and such, but it's the one system that also ages really well in terms of it weathers like a good leather jacket, in terms of the look, from that perspective.
It should also be noted that CU very much relies on the penetration into timber. So your less dense species, like our Vulcan timber, for instance, is the better surface to use. While it does definitely work on hardwood, would you say it doesn't last as long on hardwoods, or am I speaking out of turn there?
They look different, Stephen. They look different in terms of what it
Yes.
does, and obviously, it's not going to change the characteristics of what the timber does. If that timber has surface shaking or has a high amount of movement, it's not going to change the inherent characteristics. But the look of it is very consistent in terms of the look perspective. So
Yeah, awesome. So for our second to last timber coating type, we're actually going to have a quick look at penetrating stain. So this is a type of coating which has actually been designed to gently erode over time. And as far as I'm aware, and Cliff can correct me, there's only two here on the market here in Australia. Our Abodo Protector Oil, which is one, comes in an array of colors, and then there's one other. This isn't actually a new technology. It's been around for a few decades. I think we're just maybe a little bit further behind. For us, it's important to understand we're a timber company and we're interested in selling as much timber as possible, which is why we actually, worked with a company in New Zealand and, said to them, we're wanting something that's as low maintenance as possible. When it comes to maintaining it, it's got to be quite DIY and easy and cost effective. And we want the timber to actually weather as evenly as possible. So that's actually, this is newly completed. This is actually, I went and revisited this project 3 years later, and this is a close-up of the garage door. Now this actually faces direct west, and you can now see, with a combination of a stable timber, a fine sawn surface, and a quality stain, how your timber can actually look.
and
yes.
Stephen, interesting. Me and Joe spoke about this in past seminars. And I think Joe, you might want to quickly before we get into the questions. But basically, a penetrating stain on cladding it performs better in terms of moisture movement from a coating perspective. So every different coating has its performance better in different areas. So, example, film-based coating, go right back to the beginning, is better for abrasion resistance, but also has a little bit of good deflection from that perspective. So whereas when it comes to cladding, where moisture movement is really, really, really important from a movement perspective, a penetrating stain is better, not only from that perspective, but also when it comes to restoration. It's much more easier to wash it and redo it rather than strip it and redo it.
Yeah. So this is that same garage door, also 3 years later. And it was actually just redone almost 5 years later, just a couple of weeks ago. There's something also interesting to note is darker colors versus lighter colors. So darker colors in stains do last longer. So this is a black. It's our ebony, and this is what it looks like 3 years later. So it's a beautiful, even weathered black. And this is a Western. Now, I'd like to point out that this building all around, I visited this myself, and I've got a whole suite of photos of the whole house, and all the facades look exactly the same, weathered very evenly. And then this is a Western facing wall. And this used a lighter color. So it used one of our blonde tints. So you can see the difference. So while it probably isn't good for building efficiency, if you're selecting, a black stain, which everyone wants, although everyone's starting to do sort of darker walnut tones, they're always going to last a lot longer. And I'm just going to quickly skip over that. So a topic which I need to cover is charring. Now, charring is currently used as an aesthetic thing here in Australia.
Steve, sorry, I know you could probably talk for an hour about charring, but just keep it down to 1 minute.
Yeah, listen, Daisy's on there, Joe. I can't wait.
So with charring, in short, you can expect your charring to look like this within a couple of years, particularly charred hardwood. So this is an actual charred hardwood, and this was within 2 to 3 years. So a charred hardwood is not going to stay a rich black, and because hardwood is so dense, you can't get a nice structural layer. within it. So it is going to look like this within a couple of years. And interesting to note, you can actually see the late wood bands have really weathered back, and the early wood is still looking pretty good. So getting to the end, moving forward, if there was like one thing, that you could take away from this, which I know I haven't really discussed, and Cliff actually mentioned this, was principles of good detailing. And good detailing can make also a massive difference to lowering the maintenance. So what does good detailing look like? Allowing for airflow by using ventilated cavities with cladding, never allowing water to pool behind, so allowing for water to drain. Your end grain of your timber must always be protected. And cladding and tongue groove should have a good depth, and use a low moving timber. So this is actually an extract from our code mark manual. So we've got a whole suite of cladding drawings. So this is really showing you the drawing. So you've got a 10 millimeter spacer, which is allowing for your airflow and your water drainage. And then also at the end here, this is saying a 5 millimeter gap at the bottom of the board. We would prefer a 10 millimeter gap. One of the other key things, which I'm really happy to see a lot of my builders taking up, is don't do a 90-degree cut at the bottom of your board. Always have it's sloping back, as you can see, and this creates your natural drip groove.
We do a whole webinar.
We actually do have a whole CPD webinar just on detailing. So key considerations for low maintenance feature timber: stable timber, textured surface with a preference of fine bandsawn, penetrating stains, quality detailing and install. I know I've seen many good details drawn and the builders have not done what they've supposed to. But also very importantly is, I know I've been in this business 15 years, and if a coating company or a timber manufacturer comes to you and they say, oh yeah, no, look at this piece of wood, with the coating on, how have they got proof of how that has weathered over time? Always ask for proof of the weathering, whether it's driving past projects or whatever it may be.
That's a very good point, Steve. Just project examples to go and have a look at. We've got hundreds of people on our call, and a lot of them have hung in there. So I'm going to be quite brutal in going through these questions. And if either one of you two gentlemen want to shoot me down in flames, just yell out. Otherwise, I'll move on to the next question. And I'll try and answer them as quickly as possible. Starting at the top from Richard. If we are specifying timber, we want to make sure how to prolong the life and appearance of it. I think we've answered that all the way through. I'll just leave it at that in terms of those key takeouts at the end there that Steve summarised. I work on a lot of projects in the Pacific and in high humidity, salt environments and marine environments, high cyclonic areas. It's always good to know what products which will last. I mean, timber likes a humid environment, probably doesn't like a very dry environment, likes a stable environment. A salt environment will not necessarily affect the timber, it will affect more probably the coatings perhaps. So you need to research the coatings. We have had trouble with stains in the past, so hopefully we've answered some of those questions. It's a very confusing environment, Simone. What we've been through.
By the contractors, hence the reason why the rise of pre-coating in the last 10 years in Australia, where there's much more industrial application, that there was a preference from a cladding perspective and battens that you'll get a far better application in factory, although in some situations where it's a bit more niche and such, it does help to have a painting contractor to do doors and windows and other bits and pieces or more places, but there's much more industrial application now these days, Simon. So, yeah, just reach out.
It's an excellent point. As partners, Oboto and Britain Timbers, we do advocate strongly a preference for factory-based coating applications. So the timber comes out pre-finished, with 2 or 3 coats, well pigmented, high quality coatings. That is a key success factor in
And you take the variables of weather,
Thanks.
timing, contractor experience all out of it. You're taking those variables out. That's why. So.
Yeah. Interested in how timber treatment technologies are changing, both heat treatment and coatings. My particular interest is in sustainability, so low VOC, durability. So I think, I guess our promotion of penetrating pigmented oils. I mean, these oils, not so much the mineral-based oils, but the penetrating oils are generally organic and plant-based, very low VOCs, but we have all that information on our products, and I'm sure other manufacturers will have that information.
And if they don't, Joe, then you should request it, because sometimes some coating manufacturers don't make their material safety data sheet available. But as a responsible architect, I would be asking for the data sheet to make sure that what you're specifying is suitable for the client, because clients are much more aware of source of origin of material these days and what the materials are made from. So,
absolutely. We live in a Bell 29 rated area with temperatures ranging from sub-zero to 40, and have the sometimes something alpine zone. So we're interested in preserving in these climates. You must go to our website and check out our Cadrona display cabin on the South Island in the ski fields, and also some projects in India, and some very high. So we've got timber around the world that is performing in these sub-zero conditions, and also very high dense, high heat areas. But yeah, if you need any further information on Bell rating areas, we can help you with that. Wood Solutions is a very good resource. Wood Solutions website is a good resource on Bell required timbers. Would also like to know how to best achieve black finishes. One thing that you may have missed is that the darker the pigment, the longer it'll last, the longer it'll fade. Sometimes people think, somebody asked the question, oh, well, if you put black on there, it's going to attract more heat, so it's going to last less time. Not so much. I mean, the heat becomes an issue for the substrate being the type of timber. So you want a good, stable, low-moving timber to handle the heat that you attract from the black. But the coating itself, combined with the things that Steve was talking about in terms of penetration, the fine sawn finish, good pigmentation to the timber, you're going to get, and possibly that third coat that Steve was talking about, these are all elements that are going to come into the mix to give you a good long-term performance for your black finishes.
Absolutely, Joe. That's the most misunderstood thing about black finishing. I think that's a bit of a myth out there, that yes, you can use black, but it's actually the substrate and its thermal movement. So you put black on a high moving species, you're going to see warp, you're going to see cut. But then you put on a modified species, you won't see the movement. So it's really the situation more than anything else.
Thank you, Cliff. Interested in knowing the best way to ensure the longevity of the timber for the application used, hence coatings types. I think we've answered all that, and the life warranty. So we've got, want to understand best methods for modern timber applications, technology. I think that was more of a statement. Hi, I have a boat shed project. It's from Shane. I have a boat shed project built on the river, which has tidal changes, so it's constantly going wet, dry in saltwater environment. The weatherboard cladding is dry dress jarrah for heritage reasons. The weatherboard need to remain clear finished as they become the internal wall finish remain invisible. Can you recommend a clear finish that could cope under these conditions? That's quite a specific situation. I might get you, Shane, to contact Cliff or Steve or myself, and we can help you in more detail with that particular application. Black finish is bad for timber. I think we dealt with that. Can you comment on rough sawn versus fine sawn? Would rough sawn have a similar absorbent surface? Well, yes, I think in my opinion, rough sawn versus fine sawn. I mean, rough sawn you could probably end up using a whole lot more coating product. But Cliff, do you have any comment on
The only
rough sawn
difference
versus
is
fine
obviously the
sawn?
blade they use in the cutting, and obviously the rougher it is, the more you open up the cells, and therefore you're probably going to you will get more coating absorption on the rough sawn rather than the fine sawn. But the practical realities of it is fine sawn will perform as well. I don't know too many applications, but we've had to do rough sawn. Joe or Stephen, have you? I haven't seen that many in the last 10 years.
Steve, more questions to go, but I'm just thinking we should deal with the CPD questions now, and then if whoever wants to hang about, the three of us are here for a while. We can deal with the ongoing questions in the chat.
Did anyone have issues with the CPD questions?
Did you want to run through them, or?
I'm just waiting for someone to say something. I prefer not to because it's a challenge, but I also made the questions.
Well, you're getting a bit harder in your old age, Steve. I mean, normally you just.
Okay. So the first question was, what's the most vulnerable part of the timber? I don't think I covered that very well. The end grain. The end grain is the most vulnerable part.
Yes, you want to protect it well. You also want to give it good clearance for good drainage and ventilation.
What does thermal modification do to timber? It makes it more durable, and it makes it more stable. Yes, Angus, end grain.
And makes it look awesome as well.
What's the optimal surface texture when using timber externally? I don't know. What is? Oh, fine sawn. I'm kidding. Yes, it's fine sawn. Provide 2 reasons why we coat timber. Minimize cracking, minimize movement, minimize warping, but primarily it acts as a water repellent.
And also to manage differential weathering and to keep the project looking good.
Stable timber is important for lowering maintenance. True or false? True. What are 2 principles of good detailing with timber cladding? Good ventilation and airflow, water drainage, and not allowing water to for the end grain to sit in water, not allowing the end grain to sit in water. I should have made this an hour and a half session. And then in the architects,
Is that it?
Just the 6.
Okay. So for whoever wants to hang about, we can keep going with the questions.
There's been a lot
Can cedar be left unpainted? Well, you can actually leave any timber unpainted if you want. You can do what you like. But I mean, but cedar, like our Vulcan timber or the hardwoods, the same principle applies. Coating a timber, all the reasons Steve just went through, good protection, good aesthetic management. But if you're going to leave any timber uncoated, including cedar, the sun will, the UV from the sun will convert it to, it'll silver off. If there are parts where the UV can't get to it, they'll stay sort of brown or orange, whatever the colour of the timber is. Okay, and just maybe 1 or 2 more questions and we'll close off the session. What sort of coating would be best for a naturally grey timber look that still protects the timber? Are there coatings that provide grey pigmentation to protect the timber and assist the greying process? That's a good question. I think probably at the top there is the CIOX or CO video is a consideration for you. There are 1 or 2 other products around the place that do promote as an accelerated greying process.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, Joe. CE would be at the top of the tree, and there's a mid-grey and light grey in the option now in terms of it. but it's more, like I said, Joe, it's got long credibility of long use in Europe. It's used in New Zealand, parts of the world. So it's got well documented case study, and it doesn't hide what's in it. There's zero VOC. I haven't seen a coding that can actually say that openly.
Thanks, Cliff. And this makes this the final question. There are other questions, but please, in the interest of everybody's time, please shoot through your questions to us independently. So the final question is, what causes external timber to blacken? Is it inappropriate coating systems or inappropriate timber selections? Actually, it's probably both. I mean, sometimes you do see these tragic situations of blackened timber, which is basically mold. And where there's mold, there's unwanted moisture. And where there's unwanted moisture, it's generally caused through a combination of bad detailing or high moving timbers, or a combination of those things where moisture gets into the system. And then the coatings start to break down, and then the mold starts to come in. So it's a combination of things. Gentlemen, well done.
Thank you both.
Well done,
Thank you
Steve.
very, very much. It just makes it so much better if there's other people chipping in. Everyone doesn't have to listen to my voice. I hope it was of value. And yeah, thanks again. Thanks everyone for taking the time to watch.
Awesome job, Steve. You've done really well.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thank you,
See you
Joe.
next time.
Love you all.